that, we'll go ahead and start with our webinar. Bill Anderegg is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Utah. He's also an associate research scholar at Princeton University. He received his PhD from Stanford University in biology, and his research focuses on the impacts of climate change on western U.S. forests. Recent elevated dieback of aspen after severe droughts in the 2000s has prompted concern about the future of aspen in a changing climate. Bill will give an overview of what is currently known about drought stress on aspen physiology and mortality, and what this means for the future of aspen forests in a changing climate. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Bill and mute myself, and if anybody has any questions, please let us know how we can help, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming and tuning in today, and especially to Bill.
Great. Well, thank you, Megan, and I also want to thank Paul for the invitation to chat with you all this morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Anderegg, and this the story today starts down a lonely mountain road here in southwestern Colorado, and the background is that how I got into all this and really came to study aspens and drought is that I grew up in the southwestern corner of Colorado, camping in these mountains here. And coming back during my dissertation, I started to see more and more sites that looked like this. They were skeletal forests in many of the same places that I had grown up camping. And that really prompted a lot of the research and that I'll talk to you about today. So first, we'll just do a quick overview of some of the challenges that forest ecosystems will face in a rapidly changing climate. And then we'll jump into the details of this recent aspen mortality during severe drought. First, talking about why was the early 2000s drought lethal? What made it kill aspens when previous droughts generally did not on this scale? Second, we'll talk about the physiology. How does drought kill, and what can we do with that? And third, we'll talk about what are the predictions for the future, and how can the physiology of how a tree dies improve our ability to predict aspen mortality. And then finally, I'll conclude with a short outlook, specifically focusing on climate change and drought stress. And then I'm also happy to take questions as we go or at the end as well. So the context for all of this is that we know quite well over the past 110 years, and especially the past 50 years, that human emissions of greenhouse gases are driving a rising temperature across the planet. This is the global average surface temperature, and the warming is even higher over continents and often higher at high elevations. Now, one of the things that a rising temperature can do is it can lead to more drought stress. Higher temperatures lead to higher evaporative demand. This lowers soil moisture, and as we indeed see in lakes all across the West, this is a fairly familiar sight, that there's a lot of falling lake levels that temperature and drought lead to. And this is predicted to increase going forward into the future. So what's shown here is this is a snapshot of how the future could look in our state-of-the-art climate models. So the colors here, what's shown is soil moisture on the top, and it's the percentage change at the end of the 21st century, 2080 to 2100, minus 1980 to 2000. So it's the end of the century minus roughly today. And red areas mean that those are the areas projected to get drier, have decreases in soil moisture. The dots indicate where there's a strong agreement among climate models. And this soil moisture drop and then this higher evaporative stress during hotter times leads to more frequent and more severe drought stress. That's what the bottom map is showing you here, that now hot colors are showing the Palmer Drought Severity Index, where negative numbers mean drought stress, and anything below -2, -3 is really quite severe drought stress. So this is in the high emissions scenario. This is a snapshot of where we could be headed, and it's really to show that in many regions of the world, and you can see, let's see if I can do this pointer here, especially here, there's a lot of robust agreement in the southwestern United States that we're headed towards a future of more frequent and more severe droughts. There's an incredible amount of agreement among climate models about this. And in response to relatively moderate changes in temperature and drought in the past several decades, we've started to see instances of widespread regional forest die-off. This is lodgepole pines here in British Columbia, and there are really instances of this occurring around the world. So these are different snapshots of different forests from different regions of the world. And in fact, this top middle one here is some of the same aspen die-off that we'll be talking about, but in Alberta. And if we look at this globally, the most recent data that we have comes from this map. This is a map that Craig Allen and I have put together. And what's shown here is every dot is an example of a regional forest mortality event triggered by either drought or temperature stress. Now, some of these are some with the same species, but you can see, especially in the western United States, there's really been a lot of mortality observed in multiple species in the past decade and a half. And this is what some of the pictures look like. So we've certainly, this bottom left is pinyon pine, Pinus edulis. These are both lodgepole pine, and then in the upper right is obviously aspen mortality. So this is a very concerning trend, especially in response to fairly minor changes in the past couple decades, minor relative to where we could be heading in the next century. Now, why should we care about forest die-off? Well, there are a number of reasons. Of course, trees provide our foundation species and have a very big role on the ecological community. And so we'd expect this cascade of effects to ripple through and affect other species, both plants and animals. There's been some indications of loss of species diversity after tree mortality. Of course, it will affect the ecosystem processes. It's likely a very complicated and difficult to disentangle relationship with things like fire, but there's likely to be some effect. And of course, it will also affect the ecosystem goods and services that forests provide to humans. This was a neat study that looked at changes in property values as the forest died off around people's properties in western Colorado. And lastly, forests are a very strong carbon sink. They take up a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere each year around the world. They take up about 25% of human emissions of CO2. And we're concerned that forests die off and a general weakening of this carbon sink could occur given if forests are more stressed and experiencing more mortality. So let's jump into the specific case of aspen here. I want to talk to you most about today is what's been called sudden aspen decline, or S.A.D for short. This is a photograph outside of Grand Mesa, Colorado, and this is roughly what it looks like. You can see all these areas through here are dead aspen crowns. In the background further, you can see these are largely dead clones back through here. Interestingly, that's a pine mortality event there in the background. And so this is really what's known about this more broadly tends to come from, this is what it looks like to be on the ground in one of these dying stands, that it's very high levels of mortality, often complete mortality in a specific area. And what's known to date primarily comes from the aerial surveys done by the U.S. Forest Service. This is a map of sudden aspen decline in western Colorado. White areas are where the plane flew. Green areas are national forests, and red areas are where relatively severe sudden aspen decline has been observed. I believe this is a 2008 map, and it's roughly at a very back-of-the-envelope sort of calculation, estimated to affect about 8% of western U.S. aspen by area. And it does seem to be, as far as the data suggests, most severe in western Colorado, affecting up to about a fifth, about 17% of these forests, again by land area. That doesn't mean 17% of the stems, that means 70% of acres have been affected. Unlike a lot of the other mortality events like the lodgepole pine and mountain pine beetle die-off, there doesn't seem to be a very large role of pathogens in sudden aspen decline. There have been a suite of secondary pathogens that don't normally kill healthy trees that occur in dying trees, and we'll come back to that later on as how that might influence it. But what that does let us know is that really it's the sensitivity to drought and climate that seems to be the driving force here, and that we want to study the physiology here. Fairly worryingly, there seems to be, in most of the forests studied to date, relatively little regrowth. You can see this sort of visually captured in this picture, that many of the understories of these dying stands look roughly like this. There's not much indication of healthy suckering. And this is probably associated with, there's been documented root mortality of the clone as well. As the canopy dies off, it does seem that the root network is dying in concert, and of course that would severely limit the ability of these forests to regrow and suggest they might be transitioning to not being aspen-dominated forests in the future. One thing that we did that I'll just mention briefly before going on is we decided to quantify the effects of sudden aspen decline on understory plant species, and what we found is that S.A.D stands tended to be trending towards being more shrub-dominated. This is in southwestern Colorado, where the mountain snowberry is the dominant shrub, and this led to a loss of the species that were typically found in aspen's understories. We found fewer plant species in dying stands, and it tended to be a lot of the iconic wildflowers like columbine that disappeared most rapidly as stands died. Now, thinking about drought and how drought affects forests, there are really two main effects that happen during drought. First, as shown by the shrinking cloud, less rainfall occurs. Second, as shown here by the sun, hotter temperatures tend to be associated with drought, and they can drive increased evaporative loss of water. Now, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at what was the drought that seems to have triggered sudden aspen decline. What did it look like? So first we looked at rain data, precipitation data. This is the rainfall anomaly, so that's the difference from average rainfall over the past 110 years at 51 aspen sites in western Colorado. The blue line is the annual value, and the black line is a 5-year running average. And right here, in the early 2000s, is generally thought to be the drought that triggered sudden aspen decline. It starts in around 2000, it ends around 2003, and it seems to be most severe there in 2002. Now, what's really fascinating is if you go ahead and glance back along this curve from the drought kind of going horizontally back, you see that actually both in the black line and the blue line, this drought was not the most severe drought in the past 110 years, that there were droughts in the 70s and in the 50s and the Dust Bowl droughts that were actually more severe in terms of a rainfall deficit. As far as we know, those droughts were not associated with this sort of widespread mortality across western North America. Now, the story starts to change if you look at the temperature at the exact same time. So this is the same rough graph, but this time showing you the temperature anomaly. And what we see is that this rainfall deficit in the early 2000s corresponds with really record-breaking growing season temperatures at the exact same time. That's largely due to human impacts on the climate system. And so when you put these two together, if we integrate these two into a more combined drought metric, I'll show you next the Palmer Drought Severity Index again. So here, negative values mean drought stress. What you can see is this early 2000s drought does start to stand out now as the most severe drought on record, but it's largely due to the severity of the temperature anomaly rather than it being drier in terms of a rainfall anomaly. For this reason, we and other folks have called this drought a climate change type drought. This is the type of drought that we will see more often in coming decades, even if precipitation does not change, simply because temperature is rising. Now, this is what's known as meteorological drought. This is precipitation and temperatures. What we care about is more the ecological drought, which is what trees experience. To do this, we started to look at the snowpack, and what we found is that this 2002 drought had, this is a shorter time series now, but it had the lowest snowpack in Colorado on record, and it also had the earliest runoff. So the growing season began quite early on in 2002 during the peak of this drought. And what this means is this combination of low snowpack, early snowmelt, and low summer precipitation led to record low surface soil moisture. And then when you throw in the high temperatures during the growing season, you end up with record high evaporative demand. And that's what I'll show you next. So here, this top panel is showing you a metric of evaporative demand. And you can see that in this case, 2002 stands out like a sore thumb. And the bottom panel is showing you the surface soil moisture. And again, you see 2002 comes out as really the most severe year on record. Now there's one final piece, which is that we want to know what's physiologically damaging to trees. And to do this, we need to know how deep their roots can go and what soil moisture reserves they're drawing on. And what we found was, in our case, so we're translating these soil moisture and evaporative demands into tree water stress. What we found was, in our case, a lot of the aspen in southwestern Colorado tend to be very shallowly rooted. So what's shown here is the oxygen isotope, which we can think of as a fingerprint to know what type of water or where in the soil are trees getting their water. And each point here is an aspen stand across a wide range of elevation, slope, and aspect. And what we found was that in general these stands tended to track these open dots here, the surface soil moisture, the top 10 to 20 centimeters, much more so than they did the deeper soil, which really suggests that aspen, at least in this region, are fairly reliant on the shallow soil moisture reserves during the growing season. So to put this all together, we know that we have meteorological drought that occurred in 2002. It led to record low surface soil moisture, and record high evaporative demand. And again, translating this to the physiology of where aspen roots tend to be found and tend to take up water, this was uniquely stressful to these trees. And also critically, this is again a fingerprint of the drought of the future, that these are the types of droughts that we expect to become more and more common. So let's jump into how drought tends to kill. Here I want to take you now to some of the physiology research that we've been doing, and this is in now the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. And what's shown here is a map of S.A.D. We've been doing remote sensing studies using satellites, using the Landsat satellite to map at a relatively high spatial resolution the slope and aspect and the patterns of sudden aspen decline. So the red areas here are where we've detected high sudden aspen decline. Yellow is intermediate, and green are healthy forests. I do this, I'll come back to that, because this is the sort of map that we are really aiming to make predictions of in order to have models that might be able to predict when and where the next S.A.D event might occur. We did three things to look at these stressed trees, we first built some troughs underneath a mature aspen clone that we mechanically separated so it couldn't transport water or carbohydrates or anything to the other stems. And I'll call this the mature forest drought experiment. Second, on smaller potted trees, we put them under drought stress, and this is a potted tree experiment. And finally, you can see that there are still plenty of trees. You can get a sense from this picture that were dying when we were out in the field in 2009, 2010. And so we used gradients. We used a gradient within the same clone going from an almost completely healthy area to an almost completely dead area as a way to look at what's failing in the tree's physiology as it dies. Now, okay, this slide didn't come out exactly as I was thinking it would. That's all right. There's a very active debate of how trees die during drought. Initially in 2008, two pathways were proposed. The first is that was termed hydraulic failure, and that's that during drought, trees are pulling harder and harder on the water in the soil to get it up to their leaves to do photosynthesis. At a certain point, the tensions inside these water transport systems get too high, and like a spring that's pulled too taut, they eventually snap. This is a process called embolism, or cavitation, and it is tiny air bubbles that shoot in and interrupt the pipes, the water transport system of the plant. When enough of this happens, eventually the plant is cut off from its water supply and it wilts. This tends to be how your houseplants die if you don't water them for a while. The other suggestion was that perhaps some plants can avoid this hydraulic failure and close the pores through which they lose water on their leaves and avoid these lethal tensions in their xylem, but they might be vulnerable then of starving, of running out of food, of stored carbohydrates, because they can't do photosynthesis at this point. It's worth pointing out that this was a really useful way to start looking at the picture, but since then we've come to realize this is probably an oversimplification, that really there's a lot of interconnections between these pathways and probably a lot more than two ways that trees die. But nonetheless, we'll start off here. The first thing we wanted to look at is, do trees tend to starve during drought? Do aspens in particular? Do we see aspens starving during sudden aspen decline? And initially, in our drought experiment, we saw no changes in the carbon reserves. So this is showing you the starch reserves, and the same is true of sugars. Those are the primary two food reserves in aspens. And you can see here the drought being the right-hand bars in red. There's really no declines and even increases in most of the tissues during drought. What really convinced me was then when we went out to our gradients of looking at trees dying in the field, we again saw no changes in the carbohydrates of these dying stems in any region, tissue, time period, or amount of stress up to about a week or two before mortality. So this really suggests that as aspens die, they don't tend to run out of food. Now, if we start to look at some of the other things that might fail, so this is my diagram here of how drought is going to lead us to aspen mortality. The other possibility is that these water transport systems, this hydraulic failure, that during drought these start to get damaged. So we can look at this in the same set of experiments. This is how you measure hydraulic conductivity here. This is a lab at the University of Utah, and there's an aspen branch that we're measuring right here. And in essence, it's a very simple technique. You're pulling water through an aspen branch to see how well it can pipe water. What we found was, now what's shown here is the percent loss of hydraulic conductivity. So 0 means a completely functional branch, and 100% means a completely blocked, unable to transport water branch. What we found is that S.A.D branches tended to be up here at 70, 80%, 60 to 80%, which is roughly thought to be close to lethal values for many angiosperm tree species. We had an intermediate treatment that was kind of in the middle, And then healthy trees were down in the 10 to 20%, which is where most trees tend to get to on a hot summer day that's not damaging. Now, in our experiments, we saw a similar thing. That shown here, we saw more of this loss of conductance start to show up in the branches, and there especially seemed to be a lot happening in the roots, although as you can see by the width of this, or the height of this box, there's a lot of variability. Now, when we were out there making measurements, another drought struck. We were monitoring some healthy aspens and some S.A.D stems as well, and what we were really lucky to catch is that during the 2012 drought, which was not quite as severe as 2002, but still relatively close, we started to see this large drop in branch conductivity here of the dying trees with some amount of recovery. It's worth pointing out that the S.A.D trees also had a drop, but they're just barely hanging on anyway. These branches are barely conducting water. Using sap flow, you can also see this over the whole tree pathway. From the root to the leaves, you see again this huge drop during drought. This is the pre-monsoon period, and then the monsoon rains come in a little bit in July. And then there was a second dry down that was also quite dry in summer 2012. So to summarize, we do see a substantial amount of embolism or cavitation during drought in aspen as they get stressed and start to die. That there does seem to be something very interesting going on in the roots, that root cavitation could be quite important, but it's very variable and also very difficult to measure. It's hard to find and dig up roots in a way that does not damage them to make this measurement. And finally, we observed this happening during the middle of a drought in the field as well. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So you might ask, is that all we need to know about the physiology? But if you've paid a little bit of attention to the dates I've used, or are really familiar with sudden aspen decline more broadly, you'll realize that there's one fairly important wrinkle here. And that's that the trees don't actually seem to die from the drought during the drought. That this drought, as I explained, tends to peak in 2002 in the southwestern U.S. And yet mortality, as best we can tell, really ramps up through about 2008 and then starts to decline after that. So that's with trees even still dying in 2009, 2010, and 2011. So that's a fairly large disconnect between when the drought occurs and when the stems, the ramets, actually die. So we thought maybe there were three possible hypotheses. Now at this point, perhaps dying stems are in a feedback where their roots die off and they experience higher water stress. That might be one way that they could die for years later, but not during the drought itself. Second, perhaps they've actually been damaged, and so they're more vulnerable to subsequent water stress, even typically survivable water stress, like a seasonal pre-monsoon water stress. Or third, perhaps this is where the elevated insect and fungal attacks come in this spiral of decline to eventually push trees over the edge. So we tested each of these, and I'm not going to go into all of them today. But what we did find was substantial support for this number 2, that actually drought-damaged aspens did seem to have a higher vulnerability. So what's shown here, this is what this graph illustrates, is we're showing again this percent loss of conductivity, so 100% is completely damaged, between healthy and S.A.D trees as you decrease decrease the pressure or increase the tension. So as you move towards -4, that's more and more tension on these xylem cells. What you can see is that relative to the healthy trees here in gray, the S.A.D trees start to lose their ability to pipe water much, much more rapidly, such that a typical seasonal water stress for these trees can be between -1 and -2 megapascals. And that puts our healthy trees in this perfectly survivable 20% range, and really puts our S.A.D trees upwards of this 70% lethal range. This is a process that's been observed in the lab before in other tree species called cavitation fatigue. It's sort of damage to the cells that conduct water. And also interesting, we noted that even healthy aspens seem to have a little bit of fatigue relative to what other lab groups had measured on non-droughted trees, and relative to several clones that we found that were tapped into a permanent water supply during the drought. Finally, there does seem to be certainly evidence for these insect feedbacks, that we do see in dying trees this suite of several fungi and several beetles. Shown here is the poplar bark borer that do seem to attack these dying trees and accelerate their spiral of decline. So this is, I think, also where these secondary agents come into the story. I see we have a question here that just popped up asking about the differences between healthy and dying aspens, and is it genetic or environmental? That's a great question, and this is a perfect place to answer it. So what we know from these aerial survey studies, this is work by Jim Worrell's group at the Forest Service, is that it really seems like there's a dominant driver of environmental gradients that we see. I don't think I have a figure showing this, unfortunately, but we see the highest mortality at low elevations and south and west facing aspects. So really the sites that you would expect to just be under the most drought stress. They would just bake from the heat. And there's some pattern, too, that as you move towards more exposed slopes and shoulder slopes, you see slightly more mortality where there ought to be less soil moisture than you see in drainages and gullies where there should be more soil moisture. There certainly is probably some genetic component. You might have noticed, I think in this picture back here, there's some pattern based on, well, I won't go all the way back. There's a pattern that does seem to be clonal, that certain clones do seem to be more vulnerable. But it's probably mostly swamped by the environmental gradients, that it does seem like even within a clone gets these observational gradients, a slight change in from going from a slight gully to a slight shoulder slope, even on the order of 6 or 8 feet of elevation change, seems to be enough within the same clone to push part of it over the edge and have part of it survive. Great, thank you for that question. And so this process, this kind of iterative failure of the cavitation of the tree's xylem and the attack by pests and pathogens, tends to, I think, give us how this multi-year decline works, that part of the canopy dies, more branches die over several years, and eventually the entire stem dies well after the drought, even if soil moisture reserves have recovered. So what does this mean? This means that first, potentially with this physiology, we can make more robust predictions of where this might happen in space, which areas and regions are likely to be most vulnerable to mortality. And second, it suggests that there might be more mortality coming down the pipeline from the 2012 drought, seeing as how we're only now at 2015, and there can be often a 3, 5, 6 year lag or longer. And indeed, I was just out in Colorado this past summer, and we started to see more mortality tick up again in some of the same stands that we had been monitoring since 2012, where there really wasn't much mortality beforehand. So let's talk about the spatial patterns. What we were able to do is use this threshold in a hydraulic capacity to be able to predict where mortality occurs as a function of the drought water stress. So here we're modeling the drought water stress using a hydrological model. This is a variable called climatic water deficit. And it's best to think of it as kind of an integrated drought metric. So higher numbers mean more drought stress. And we found that our threshold in plant physiology really did line up reasonably well with where we see this strong increase in mortality going towards higher drought stresses across the landscape. if we come back to this map now, we have this satellite-generated map, and try to predict, in this case we're making a hindcast. We're going to try to predict where S.A.D should have occurred, just knowing only about the drought and this threshold in plant water transport. We're able to predict the spatial patterns of S.A.D relatively well, that we can predict it with about 75% accuracy. And we predict correctly that you see more mortality on lower elevation sites here. So this is what you'll see in the satellite. And we do predict that you see it much more strongly on south-facing slopes as opposed to north-facing slopes. So here red colors mean highly dead, and yellow colors mean relatively healthy aspen forest. I think this is a good time to take the next question here. Could I comment on the pros and cons on the use of studies with individual potted trees to understand drought-responsive clonal trees in the field? It's a very great question. So the advantage of using potted trees and individual trees is that you can obviously measure what's going on in their canopy with much better resolution. That you can make measurements on leaves, whereas a lot of these tall aspen canopies, it's very difficult to get up to the canopies to measure. Certainly, there are a lot of disadvantages, given that you're working with small trees that are isolated. They don't have the same ability to tap into soil moisture. What we really tried to do was bounce around back and forth between the potted trees and then the mature trees in the field. So a lot of these measurements I'm showing you are actually taken on mature trees that are still part of their clone. So this is shooting down with a shotgun, for example, samples of branches of these dying stems that are out there in the field in situ. So what's nice is with aspen you can really do both and see if they tell you the same answer, and if they don't, obviously the mature trees in the field is much more valuable to look at what's happening. So I think just to wrap up, I'll move into the final section here as I see some of the major drivers heading towards the future. And I'm going to frame this a little bit as what we know relatively well and what we don't know. And I want to try to give you a sense of the breadth of our understanding of the stresses facing aspens and to what extent they can be or might be mitigated. So the big picture points as I see them is what we do know is that aspen is a relatively water-loving tree in a dry landscape. That we do know temperatures across the West are going to rise in the 21st century. As we saw from some of these previous studies, that temperature is a really important component of drought, and that hot droughts tend to be more lethal, all else equal, at the same precipitation level. So what this does say is that we can absolutely expect more droughts in the future and more mortality. And the final piece is that, as we all know, there's you can only go uphill so far in the mountains, in that if you, obviously as you move uphill, things get wetter, and that means there's a limited amount of space in many of these regions where aspens are found for them to move uphill. So I would list these 5 points as very solidly supported statements of what we know, and I think the inference we can draw from this is that we're going to see more mortality and potentially lose aspen from some regions in the West. People might argue with that, but that's the statement I'm going to go ahead and throw out there, and I'm happy to discuss more and talk more about that in the questions section. I'll quickly pause here. I see I have another question. Okay, so first 2 questions. It looks like, well, actually, before I get to these questions, I'll just finish the rest of the presentation here. I don't have too much left. So here are the big unknowns as I see them. We don't have a very clear sense of whether whole clones are dying or not, or whether it's just a massive pruning of the above-ground biomass of a clone. But it's worth noting that for some questions, like what's the loss of carbon from these plants, are they still going to provide shade, things like that, this is kind of a moot point of whether the clone is living or dying. We don't have a clear sense of how much genetic diversity can buffer from this and really how much of a role genetic diversity plays, and that comes back to that great question earlier on. We don't really have a good sense, much less so than temperature, what precipitation changes will be in the West. The majority of climate models suggest a drying and less precipitation, but that precipitation is a lot more difficult to know at a regional scale in the coming decades. And we don't know how much expansion uphill and into other sort of forests can occur. There's some evidence that aspen might be moving into the dying lodgepole pine forests. This is kind of an unknown of how much space there will be and how fast they'll be able to either expand clonally or potentially through seed. And then there's not too much understanding of how we might use management actions to prevent or build resilience to S.A.D. What I will, I'll touch on that just a little bit in one more slide. And then finally, and potentially one of the biggest levers on this system, and this is actually a lever that we do control quite a bit of, at least as a society, is we don't know how much the world will warm. In a low emissions, in a future where we do something about climate change relatively rapidly, it's looking like Aspen will face a lot less stress and a lot less mortality as opposed to a high climate change future. So what's been done to date, so this is work by Jerry Rayfeld, is we do have a pretty good sense that the climate that is suitable for aspens is likely to shrink going forward in the future. So what's shown here in this map is where they predict in the colors for aspen to occur, and then the polygons are the range map of where aspen does occur. And if you take this suitable climate model and project it forward, it doesn't even matter too much which climate model you're using. Each row here is a different climate model. You can see that this range starts to shrink, and especially by the end of the century, the habitat that we tend to think of as suitable for aspens has shrunk quite a bit, between 40 and 90%. What we did is we used this hydrological model now that we have this climatic water deficit with a threshold, and we looked going forward, and you can see that there tends to be more and more drought going forward into the future. And if you compare this to the mortality threshold, the average aspen forest, and this is in southwestern Colorado here in the San Juan Mountains, the average forest tends to cross this mortality threshold and stay above it in the 21st century, but it really matters which climate future we are on. This is looking at the high climate change scenario with very little action to rein in climate change. If you instead look at the lower climate change scenario, in several of the models, you don't see an actual trend of increasing climatic water deficit and its mortality risk. So that's a fairly, I think, important lever on the system. Just a few, I'd say, back-of-the-envelope management implications. I do think this suggests that there is some importance for maintaining high-elevation aspen habitat and on northern slopes, that will be valuable for places where trees can survive even as the climate warms and gets drier. There does seem to be some evidence from folks like Wayne Shepard that relatively quick action on harvesting these areas, at least before on the order of 30% of the canopy dies off, might be able to stimulate suckering before the roots tend to die off with the canopy. This is some early work coming out of that. And then more anecdotally, we observed a reasonable amount of ungulate pressure knocking back the suckers that did get established and probably contributing to these low regeneration rates in dying stands. So with that, I'll go ahead and thank you all for joining today on this webinar, and I'm happy to start taking questions. Thank you all very much. Megan, would you prefer that I just go back through this list, or do you want to read some of them to me?
No, I think, Bill, you just go ahead and address the questions as you can read them and however you think makes most sense.
Okay, sure. So I think I might start at the top where I missed a few of these. So did we? It looks like
you can scroll. You can scroll up.
Yeah. I think I can do this.
I think you got, after Rick's question, I think was Aaron's question.
Yeah, one from Aaron. Okay. Did we see a relationship between climatic water deficit and water potential across our sites? That's a great question. We weren't able to test that, unfortunately, because we weren't measuring water potential during the drought itself. We weren't out there in the field during 2002, unfortunately. But what we did see was a very strong threshold relationship between this drought metric, this climatic water deficit, and the hydraulic conductivity of branches. So you can think of that as the kind of raw functionality and capacity of these branches. And there was a very strong cliff that above a certain amount of climatic water deficit, this conductivity just crashed heading towards zero. That's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so John, many other areas. Okay. So many other areas in Western North America showed evidence of increased mortality, but didn't experience sudden Aspen decline. Was the drought not as severe in other areas? Yeah, that's a good question. So it does seem there were certainly differences in the drought. The drought really seemed to be most severe. Kind of the epicenter was sort of towards the Four Corners area, and it does suggest that potentially there might be some levels of drought in which you see some mortality, but there's still enough of that root network left that the clone can recover, or even within an individual stem. These stems might be able to repair the damage that was done to their water transport system and recover rather than heading down into the spiral of decline. So, yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest questions or one of the biggest signals is where the drought was most severe, but certainly also genetic differences between these stands could be going on there as well. Okay.
Bill, I'm just going to interrupt you and ask that before people leave the meeting room, if they could just, we're going to pull up some of our poll questions right now, so feel free to keep asking and answering questions, but we're just going to ask people to maybe answer these questions before they leave for the day. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure. So it looks like the next question is from Bo. So you commented earlier that you don't observe new shoots or suckers in S.A.D stands. Is this let's see if I can make this screen bigger. Okay, now I can see questions a lot better. Do you think this is a direct effect of cavitation fatigue or a lack of resources in the clone, or is it an indirect effect? That's a really good question. We suspect that it's probably a combination of these. I think the single biggest signal is actually that the roots are dying back at relatively close to the same rate as the canopy. And so obviously if you don't have healthy roots, it's really hard to have those roots sending up suckers. We do think this ungulate pressure did seem to play a role, but my suspicion is you see on the order of only 10% of what we might think of as healthy regeneration rates in S.A.D stones anyway, and in S.A.D stands anyway, and I suspect that that's due to the root mortality, and then the ungulate pressure is probably knocking you even lower from there. How does the question from Aaron, how does the physiology of aspens fit into isohydric versus anisohydric? And does this mechanism of mortality... Sorry, I'm trying to see the rest of this question here. Okay, and does this mechanism of mortality observed match what is predicted?
Bill, we're trying to multitask and you're trying to answer questions. So. Sorry about that.
So aspens tend a little bit more towards the anisohydric end of the spectrum. That is, they don't tend to be they tend to be less conservative. They tend to be more risky with their water use and not regulating their stomatal water loss. What's interesting is that it's becoming more and more clear that actually most, even if species are relatively more isohydric, it's thought that this is more of a continuum rather than distinct strategies, that even the isohydric species do seem to be experiencing hydraulic damage. So even a lot of the work coming out of pinyon pines that are thought to be quite isohydric do seem to be experiencing hydraulic damage. But aspen is definitely, we observed it as quite a bit more profligate with its water loss. Jody asks, does the size of the aspen stand play into the model? In other words, stands with more root mass being better able to survive. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and unfortunately we weren't able to answer that size question. We really weren't looking too much to try to delineate clone boundaries or really stand boundaries, but we would absolutely expect that stands should be able to kind of tune this ratio to get more root mass relative to evaporating leaf area, and that should help stands survive. We weren't able to measure it, but I think that is probably a fairly important mechanism. And then Dave asks, is there a physiological basis for predictions about what species might replace aspen when mortality is high? Yeah, that's a really good question. There's not a robust physiological basis for predicting this right now, unfortunately. Really, the best we can do is look at kind of the co-occurring species with aspen, and also the species that tend to be found a little bit drier from them. So in many cases, for example, ponderosa pine is the lower, the species below some aspen forests, and at least in southwestern Colorado, we roughly expect that eventually those forests will trend towards being kind of gamble oak, ponderosa pine forests. It's likely that there's going to be some fairly strong lags, that the mortality that's happened is going to be at sort of a faster rate than we start to see these other forests come in. And so it's possible that some of these areas might be sort of meadows or brushlands for a while before some other trees move in. John asks, how quick in the shepherd study, same year? It wasn't done in the same year. It was done, I believe in the next couple years. The main thing they quantified was not necessarily how many years from when mortality started. They quantified it based on a percent canopy dieback of the different stems, and they really found that the stands that were harvested below 30% canopy dieback seemed to have fairly robust suckering, and when it got to be above 30% dieback, relatively little suckering. So rather than it being a little bit more of rather than it being a time question, it really seemed to be a state of the overstory clone as kind of a proxy for the root network. Okay, Jody asks, in terms of restoring aspen, is prescription burning also a tool? Yeah, prescription burning is a good question. I imagine it could be a tool. I haven't seen any studies on using that in S.A.D stands. I think that in general, as long as enough of the root network is still present and won't be damaged by that prescription burning,